There are many names for the wars in Vietnam. The French called theirs the War Without Front Lines. Ho Chi Minh and his faction of the Vietnamese Communist Party called it the People's War. For the Americans, it was simply the Unconventional War. The United States fought an elusive enemy with helicopters and superior firepower under stifling political and military rules of engagement. The North Vietnamese suffered grievous casualties, but outlasted the U.S. force with intelligence, evasiveness, patience, and terror. The fact that the U.S. military's superior firepower might have defeated other armies was lost in a failure to understand the political and military situation it faced in Vietnam. Southeast Asia would become an important battlefield for a new kind of army of unconventional soldiers. Led by the U.S. Army Special Forces and Navy SEALs Special Operations, with code names like Phoenix, 34 Alpha, Delta Force, and studies and observation groups are distant reminders of the secret and savage struggle for the hearts and minds of the people.
I think there's no doubt at all that the Pentagon was very arrogant during the Vietnam War. They felt that they had the technology, they had the God-given right to win the war. They had political, technological, and almost philosophical arrogance, and that was a real problem.
Indeed, the expression, hearts and minds of the people, would affect how the U.S. military would remold itself after Vietnam, and it continues to be a primary focus for U.S. military operations.
The strategy or objective, if you will, of the North Vietnamese and the whole war was stated very early. They said that their objective was to establish communism throughout Vietnam as well as in Cambodia and in Laos. To do this, they didn't invent a new strategy or new tactics in which to engage the war. They recognized that their enemies were going to be strong. They anticipated they'd fought the French. They anticipated fighting the United States. Their strategy and tactics were based upon the same that Mao had used in to establish communism in China.
In 1961, President John F. Kennedy took office. He directed that additional counterinsurgency special forces units, known as Green Berets, be sent to Vietnam. Their mission was to counter the Viet Cong propaganda efforts in the southern countryside.
That mission was primarily counterinsurgency. President Kennedy, who was fascinated by the whole concept of special forces, concluded that a unit that is trained to fight guerrilla warfare would be the logical ones to conduct counterinsurgency, counter-guerrilla operation.
The North Vietnamese had been preparing for unconventional warfare inside South Vietnam since 1957. Developing the Viet Cong agents and networks that became increasingly successful in isolating segments of the population from the existing South Vietnamese government.
And I think that a lot of the VC's credibility in the South was the fact that this was a nationalist fight, or it was portrayed as such. And I think that was very important. There's no doubt that terror and subversion was used. That's used in any guerrilla campaign, in any civil war. But it isn't the case, as a lot of American historians would like to say, that the people in the South were totally terrorized into supporting the VC. There are very strong nationalistic reasons why they didn't like the American involvement, and they didn't like the corrupt government that the Americans appeared to be supporting.
Linked to the Green Beret presence in Vietnam was the American Central Intelligence Agency. The CIA initially was in charge of all classified paramilitary operations in Vietnam.
Those guys needed Army assets to do some of the tough stuff, some of the commando operations. So they organized an Army headquarters called the Special Operations Group. Then it dawned on them that people could figure out maybe what the Special Operations Group did, and so they retitled it the Studies and Observation Group.
And our cover story was that we were analyzing the lessons learned in joint conflict and recording these for future generations and to learn as much as we could so that we could perfect the way in which we were fighting the war. And we were supposed to be staff officers and historians.
The Studies and Observation Group, known as SOG, remains one of the most secret operations of the Vietnam War. One of its first major counterintelligence operations would become its biggest failure.
The 34 Alpha program was a program that started when CIA was conducting all of the covert and clandestine operations in Southeast Asia. They had organized the South Vietnamese intelligence service in such a way that they would recruit people. The South Vietnamese would train them, and then the U.S. would help provide equipment, radios and so forth for their dispatch, and in some cases provide them with airlift into the north or surface transportation by sea into the North Vietnam.
With no resident agents in place in North Vietnam to shield the infiltrators, most saboteurs were either killed or captured, usually within hours of landing. In all, 500 agents were lost. Of the nearly 400 who were captured, some would spend as much as 27 years in prison.
It was 100% unsuccessful for several reasons. One, you've got a very authoritarian regime up there that monitors the villages. There's a little mini commissar at the lowest level. And a stranger who comes in, it's not like in the South where there was considerable mobility. A stranger comes in and he's immediately interrogated. And for one thing, the agents that were infiltrated up there didn't have good credentials. The forgeries were very inept, apparently. And for that reason, they were scarfed up.
Kennedy's written direction to expand present operations in the field of intelligence, unconventional warfare, and political psychological activities was designed to keep American soldiers out of any direct combat role.
The 34 Alpha teams that went up into the north were purely Vietnamese. There were no Americans on those teams. There may be Americans in the aircraft that dropped them, but there were no Americans on the ground.
The CIA finally realized what was happening to its agents on the ground and the extent of their failure, but the damage had been done. When these agents were captured, so were their radios.
These agents were controlled and essentially turned back on Saigon, so it became quite a source of disinformation. Furthermore, they went so far as to say, we're doing fine up here in the jungle, send us some more equipment, you know, like send us your latest radio, and by the way, what's the code? Haven't we changed the code? Things like that. So it was absolutely a total failure.
Other 34 Alpha missions were conducted using South Vietnamese mercenaries. These raids involved high-speed boat attacks on North Vietnam shore installations in the Gulf of Tonkin. The raids provoked the North Vietnamese to send their own torpedo boats into the Gulf, allegedly attacking American Navy destroyers in international waters. This incident was the rationale for President Lyndon Johnson to push the Gulf of Tonkin resolution through the U.S. Congress in August of 1964. This resolution would become the legal basis for U.S. intervention in the Vietnam War.
Sworn to Secrecy will return in a moment. Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Is it the Chrysler Sebring LXI Coupe or the Chrysler Sebring Limited Convertible? Multi-valve V6, speed-sensitive steering, room for you and 3 friends, and a luxurious leather-trimmed interior. Now, the choice is yours. Get 1,000 cash allowance on the Sebring Coupe and on the Sebring Convertible. Chrysler, engineered to be great cars.
Last year, Americans spent over $2.5 billion on products for their backs.
Here's a nice item.
Why is this market so large? It could be that some people aren't sleeping on the right mattress. We'd recommend a Sealy Posturepedic sleep system. Its patented coils give
why Donald Duck may go down in history as the savior of Kuwait. From the History Channel, the official network of every millennium, this is Time Lab 2000. In 1964, a freighter carrying 6,000 sheep sinks in Kuwait's harbor, threatening to poison the country's water supply. The ship has to be raised, but how? Then Danish engineer Carl Kreuer remembers a comic book he read as a boy, where Donald Duck had a similar problem with his Uncle Scrooge's yacht. Donald solved the problem by filling the yacht with ping pong balls, which floated the boat to the surface. So Kreuer decides to copy the idea. He pumps millions of hollow pellets into the ship's hull, and it works. But few knew the genius that came up with the solution was a duck. For the History Channel, I'm Sam Waterston.
We now return to Vietnam Special Operations.
In 1964, with confirmed evidence of the North Vietnamese Army presence inside South Vietnam, operational control of the Special Forces was transferred from the CIA back to the U.S. Army under a program called Operation Switchback. This change brought the Special Forces intelligence gathering mission to the forefront. They realized the best way to get accurate intelligence on their enemies was to find it themselves. By 1968, Special Forces had created a myriad of classified units to satisfy military intelligence needs. Inside the Studies and Observation Group, the most successful special operation was C&C, or Command and Control.
In the early conduct of the war, it was the American government decided that we were not going to go into Laos, not going to go into Cambodia, yet that was the primary source of troops who were resting and reconditioning. It was their main supply route. So it was important that we get people in there on the ground who could see what was taking place under the canopy.
SOG's sole mission was to make secret reconnaissance patrols across the fence, slang for operating over the border in the NVA sanctuaries in Laos, Cambodia, and North Vietnam. Nickel Steel was the code name for North Vietnam.
If you're thinking that that enemy-controlled territory was little guerrillas hiding under the trees, no. No. We're talking about roads with traffic that went both ways. We're talking about enormous bunker complexes and enormous installations. The entire Cambodian area along the border was lock, stock, and barrel owned by the North Vietnamese.
There are 1,000 truths about the American Indochina War. It was, in fact, 1,000 small wars fought across dissimilar terrains. SOG reconnaissance was the most dangerous mission for the Special Forces in Vietnam. It was so deeply classified that no South Vietnamese intelligence agency ever knew it existed.
I ran 24 operations across the fence. In that 24 operations, almost every one of them came out under fire. In fact, everyone that I can think of came out under fire, some more intense than others. It just was almost literally impossible to stay in there.
Behind the casualties, the bravery, and the successes were the failures, the problems, and the fear. There was an uneasy relationship between many Special Forces camps and other American units as well. American commanders resented special operations activity going on inside their jurisdiction without their knowledge.
They didn't like the idea that we had these combined U.S. Vietnamese forces that were going out of their perimeter, running the risk of being captured and revealing their location.
There were two parts to these secret units. They had small reconnaissance teams and larger companies called hatchet forces. There were never more than 150 Americans working SOG reconnaissance at any one time. SOG recon patrols operated in small, mixed groups and were for reconnaissance only.
Cross-border raids were taken care of by the Hatchet Force, which was a company to battalion-size operations, and that also operated out of command and control north, and they were also made up of mercenaries. They went in on the big, heavier strikes.
The jungle could be a quiet place where any sound would alert an enemy. Survival depended on perfect discipline. Everything was geared towards remaining invisible. The snapping of a twig or a man coughing at the wrong time meant the difference between living and dying.
And our team would be all scrunched together into a little small, I mean, you could have probably put a dinner plate over the top of us and covered every one of us. We were that tight together. And the North Vietnamese would be talking and busting brush 10 feet away. And I would be worried about my heart being hurt because it would just be pounding.
SOG teams were a major concern to the North Vietnamese Army, which devoted entire battalions to hunting down one small team. SOG missions were so dangerous, they rarely lasted more than 5 days.
On a lot of occasions, we would just run into each other. They would find us. They have been known to get shoulder to shoulder on line, just sweep through an area, try to flush us out like partridge. And they would find you, and inevitably the firefight would break out, and we would have to call in the cavalry, so to speak, to get us out, which meant the 7th Air Force.
SOG reconnaissance patrols were so perilous, they averaged over 115% casualty rate. Over the course of a year, the men were either killed or suffered multiple disabling wounds. For every man lost, SOG forces claimed 100 enemy lives.
You got 5 missions, and then you got 6 missions, and then you get hit. That changes everything. There's nothing worse than laying there and bleeding all over yourself, and the helicopters aren't coming, and it's getting, so time goes on. You get 10 missions, 12 missions. How many more can you do? You know you're going to die, but what happens is your loyalty to your little people, to your troops. You can't leave them. I didn't want to turn my team over to another American who they couldn't trust, so I stayed, and it stayed, till it got to the point where I realized I wasn't as good as I had to be to keep these guys alive. I quit.
Most of the damage inflicted on the NVA sanctuaries by SOG came from airstrikes hauled in by the teams on the ground. Like everything about SOG, it was usually a close call.
We were running towards the helicopter, and I was telling the F-4 Phantom pilot to work over the area as soon as we got off the ground because the NVA were everywhere. I jump on the helicopter, and the helicopter takes off, and I watch the jet go in and doesn't do anything. I'm screaming into the phone, you know, kill these people, kill these people. And they didn't do anything, and I was livid, and I said, what was going on? And later on I found out, he says, well, as you jumped on the helicopter, he says, there were 3 people reaching out behind you, just a foot or 2 behind you. And he says, they were so close I thought they were your team members. As it turned out, they were NVA trying to snatch me. But that's how close it could get.
Sworn to Secrecy will return in a moment.
The biggest websites, from Amazon.com to Yahoo. And the big
Brando played him in Apocalypse Now, but this is the real and deeply disturbing Colonel Kurtz.
Has to be a little bit tough.
On History Undercover, tonight at 10 Eastern, 11 Pacific on the History Channel, where the past comes alive. Dreamed of possibilities, a world that harbors the unknown, the bizarre, the dangerous. The History Channel explores its secrets, explains its beauty, and examines how it's used to destroy. It's the same planet, a different world. Dive with modern
The Internet is revolutionizing.
Several CIA-led counterinsurgency operations in Southeast Asia had been costly failures. Many field agents proved to be unreliable. Their intelligence network had become largely ineffective, frequently riddled with double agents and con men. CIA operating credibility with the Special Forces was stretched to the breaking point.
The CIA, in many cases, would come in, and they'd come in wearing pearl-handled, chrome-plated pistols and, you know, cowboy hats and act like they were bad and try to convince us that this wasn't their first operation. And by the time we quit chuckling and laughing at them, in many cases, they would tuck their tail between their leg and leave. And so there were some CIA guys that were very qualified, and there were some that were pure idiots.
On the strategic level, it was much worse. The Hanoi Politburo could simply buy American newspapers to learn the latest political developments in Washington, D.C., or read dispatches from the battlefield. But U.S. intelligence agencies had little more than strident propaganda speeches to figure out what was happening inside North Vietnam.
The communists survived from secrecy. They told many different stories, both to the media at the time and since. It's difficult to determine who was in charge and what their objectives were. Anyone that tells you that they know exactly what the North Vietnamese chain of command was at any one time is probably wrong.
A never-before-revealed document provides a fascinating and rare insight into the leadership situation in wartime Hanoi. These are the minutes of a meeting detailing a political denunciation made sometime before 1968 by a Politburo member named Le Duan against the celebrated North Vietnamese Army commander, General Nguyen Van Giap.
This is a memoir I received written by Tran Quynh, the former secretary for Le Duan and later on vice prime minister. This report was circulated in Hanoi at the time and served to discredit General Giap. It contains some things which happened back then. For example, there was a decision to remove Giap from the party central committee. But Le Duan saved Giap for fear that removing Giap would lead to the Soviet Union's cutting off support for the war effort. But at the same time, Le Duan wanted to send Giap the message that you deserve to be removed from the party central committee, but I saved you. From that point on, Giap always treated Le Duan with fear and total respect.
Portrayed as a lackey and accused of spying for the Soviet Union, Giap was severely chastised. It was only the Politburo's larger concern about losing Russian military support that saved him from public humiliation and a possible prison sentence.
As for General Giap's opinion at that time, he lost his influence in the Politburo because there was a ferocious fight within the party between Le Duan and Vo Nguyen Giap. Le Duan and his colleague Le Duc Tho suspected and accused Giap of being an agent for the Soviet Union. And because of all that, all of Giap's subordinates were apprehended, like Dang King Zhang, Nguyen Di, Le Lin, and many, many others. They were dismissed, they were demoted, or they were put in prison.
Undoubtedly, Giap was seriously weakened politically. Giap's troubles with his rivals in the Politburo may have prevented him from changing the disastrous military strategy pursued by Hanoi after the first phase of the Tet Offensive in 1968.
Back then, as General Giap saw it, the first phase of Tet was enough. We needed to stop then, and we needed to preserve our strength for a prolonged fight. But others saw the success for their own glory, and they pushed for the second and third phases of the offense. It was later that these two phases of the offense caused us tremendous losses. and many of our infrastructures were wiped out.
The inability to glean even the smallest bit of information blocked American intelligence agencies from understanding and exploiting these communist political rivalries. Unable to discern North Vietnamese political factions and intentions, American policymakers had to react to Hanoi's moves rather than anticipate. The Special Forces and later the Navy SEALs realized no victory in South Vietnam was possible without protecting the South Vietnamese civilian population. The primary mission of the Green Berets was to organize armed militias among the 31 Montagnard tribes in South Vietnam. They were tasked to protect the Laotian and Cambodian border areas from NVA infiltration.
Vietnam is not a homogeneous ethnic group. There are people there who've been living on that land before the Vietnamese arrived from the north. Montagnards who lived in the mountain areas, they hated the Vietnamese more than anything else. The CIA and Army intelligence were able to train and arm these people and use this hatred for the Vietnamese for their own advantage.
Numbering between 3 and 12 men, small groups of Green Berets called A-teams were responsible for leading, feeding, and equipping hundreds of mercenary soldiers.
Special Forces were more like anthropologists with guns and medicine bags in relation to the Montagnard tribal people. We found them to be extremely loyal. We trusted them and became blood brothers in their ceremonies and drank their ceremonial wines and found them to be very concerned fighters.
These indigenous forces were called Civilian Irregular Defense Groups. At their peak strength, the American 5th Special Forces Group controlled 84 camps with more than 42,000 members.
When I first went in there, we probably had maybe 300 Americans working in the Central Highlands. We had 25,000 troops. Your basic Montagnard private was drawing $21 a month, roughly. So you got a lot of bang for your buck.
The job of the Green Berets required more than basic combat training.
Our job was divided into different categories. The medics trying to teach medicine to their counterparts, and the weapons people trying to take platoons of indigenous soldiers, many of them Montagnard tribal people who had worn loincloths and had crossbows and poison arrows, and give them World War II carbines and submachine guns, and teach them to use the more modern weapons against the Viet Cong.
Corruption among the indigenous forces was an accepted way of life. Stealing, bribery, lying, killing their rivals was a common practice around the camps. Many times it was as dangerous inside the A-team camps as outside.
In one case, Kuang, one of my point men on the team, has a run-in with some guy who he thought was with his girlfriend, goes into the mess hall, and the guy sitting there is eating, and Kuang hits him in the head with the claw part of a hammer and kills him. These people are thugs, basically. These people, you know, that's how they deal with things.
The Green Berets who led the indigenous units suspected that up to 15% of their troops were Viet Cong infiltrators. Everyone else, from the Montagnard tribesmen to the Cambodian and Thai mercenaries to the Chinese Nungs, fought for money. Some American advisors feared that their troops would prove unreliable in a firefight and made plans for their own survival.
On my team, between myself and the American assistant team leader, we had a code word. That if I said the code word thunderclap, that we would count in our heads to 6 and then kill all of the indige on the team. I never had to do that, thank God, but we had that plan in place because you could never trust them completely, and you didn't know. They might turn on you out there for whatever reason, and you would have to kill them.
The Special Forces had no career incentives to operate this way, but given the circumstances, they often had no other option. Knowing the truth did not set them free, but it helped keep them alive.
Sworn to Secrecy will return in a moment.
The most effective and the most controversial Allied special operation of the war, CIA's Phoenix program, begun in 1968. It was a combined American-Vietnamese intelligence effort designed to disrupt the civil infrastructure of the Viet Cong. Tax collectors and high-ranking political officials were the intended targets.
A North Vietnamese soldier coming down the Ho Chi Minh Trail is as much a stranger in a strange land in South Vietnam as the Americans are. Without the Viet Cong infrastructure, and the Viet Cong had a hard time operating.
Phoenix was known in Vietnamese as Phuong Hoang. Its goal was to force Viet Cong members to either surrender or risk being killed. The immediate effects on the VC were dramatic and successful.
They would try to influence the wife of a guerrilla by giving her money or by sentimental inducement. And then one of them would marry her and divide husband and wife, and through her they might discover our secret locations and set out to destroy us. That's why I said the Phuong Hoang campaign was very dangerous and dreadful. It awoke the full concern of our superiors as to how to deal with the problem. They ordered a counter-campaign. The instructions were to first reorganize our contacts, and then we had to identify who their agents were and educate them.
The Viet Cong feared being infiltrated more than being attacked by American helicopters. As the Phoenix program began to uproot their organizations, infiltration of their ranks and defections created tremendous difficulties for the VC leadership. For the first time, Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army units faced a problem they could not handle.
I would say there were many cases of traitors. The Saigon regime used money to entice our men. If we knew any of our men had been bought, we would apply a variety of measures to deal with them. First of all, if we could not contact them personally, we would use leaflets to give them strong warnings. Or we would suddenly break into the village to capture and bring them out to suppress them, or to educate and advise them not to follow the road of a traitor. We would try and try again to do that for 3 or 4 times before we were forced to eliminate them.
The Viet Cong had used terror routinely to punish suspected enemies and to send a message to all who might resist their demands. The Special Forces had witnessed these atrocities since their arrival in Vietnam in 1958.
As for accusations that our soldiers exercise brutality against our own people, there is a need for distinction. In wartime, brutality is sometimes unavoidable. Our army is the people's army. They love people and serve their cause. But because they are also trained for social class struggle ideology, therefore murdering South Vietnam officers and people in villages and cities takes place. It is unavoidable during wartime.
Đây không phải là chỉ có bắt buộc mà gần như là có một cái tinh thần tự giác nhận cái sự lãnh đạo.
Many North Vietnamese and Viet Cong soldiers had grown tired of the war. Less than 9,000 VC and NVA soldiers called Chu Hois had surrendered to the Allied side in 1967. That figure climbed to over 20,000 in 1968 with the initiation of the Phoenix program.
Well, as the war went on and on,
casualty has some effect on the soldiers, and they just couldn't face with it anymore. Now, one of the soldiers in my unit, for example, he was very brave, brilliant soldier. He was really very good. But after one battle, and he saw human meats and intestine hanging around, and he just couldn't cope with it. He just couldn't eat. He just couldn't sleep. And in the end, you know, he gave up. It was too much for him.
The CIA had created a new armed force called the Provincial Reconnaissance Units, or PRU. It was designed to be the action arm of Phoenix. The PRU was equipped and paid for by the CIA. Organized, trained, and led by Green Berets and Navy SEALs designated as civilian advisors, PRU mercenary troops were recruited from the local areas.
Now, in my group, and they call them Provincial Reconnaissance Units, I'm telling you what they were. They were killers for money. Okay? Forget politically correct. Change it to any name you want. These guys fought for money.
When these guys worked for Phoenix, they'd be given a list of purported Viet Cong infrastructure, and during the month they would try and go around the province and kill all these people. My belief is that the PRU program and the Phoenix program was an attempt to duplicate the way the Viet Cong operated.
The Viet Cong response to this attrition among their troops was to increase their use of terror to intimidate members of the PRU and to prevent their own troops from surrendering.
Có những hành động tàn ác, có thể là những hành động mà theo cái.
Now, if this is necessary for us to be cruel, as demanded from the higher level of command, in order to eliminate people affiliated with the enemy, I would say it is something we do in order to win the war.
Mặt khác nữa,
I would never let my soldiers do bad things or make people suffer. I would investigate, pay people for the damage, and discipline my soldiers where appropriate. But if cruelty happens as a result of eliminating those who are against us, we just carry out the necessary things to win.
I had one Vietnamese lieutenant that I worked with, and he was probably the best Vietnamese junior officer that I ever knew. He was a really good kid, and I never advised him to do anything that he hadn't already done it. And they warned him a couple of times, and when he didn't slow down, they just went into his home village, which was 300 miles from where we were operating, and killed his mother.
The Viet Cong infrastructure was defined as all non-military members of the communist movement. Local Vietnamese sources were used to identify VC agents within the towns and villages of South Vietnam. American-controlled PRU units were then ordered to capture or kill them.
If they brought back a body, they got paid for it. If they brought back a gun, they got paid for it. If they brought back a prisoner, they got paid for it. If they didn't bring back the whole prisoner, they used to get paid for bringing back identifiable parts. Okay? I didn't set these rules up. These are the rules that they played by. When you try to change those rules, you meet resistance. I didn't want people bringing me back ears and me having to pay them for it. I didn't want that. I want live people. Dead people don't talk.
There is no doubt that Phoenix was effective in reducing VC influence. But as with every special operation in South Vietnam, there was always a fear of VC penetration of South Vietnamese intelligence agencies. In some instances, corrupt officials used Phoenix to eliminate business and personal rivals.
The PRU got out of hand real quick. They were not checking. They were going out killing a lot of people. In many cases, they were killing the wrong people. The Viet Cong infiltrate this and tell them to go out and kill the people who are actually friendly to the government. So there's nobody really checking on it.
In the end, the Phoenix program was stunningly effective in eliminating the established Viet Cong support system. But it came too late in the war to influence the outcome. There was another secret special operations unit, however, that was successfully developing its own intelligence and using it to great advantage. U.S. Navy SEALs were redefining the role of the unconventional soldier.
Sworn to Secrecy will return in a moment.
There was a secret American unit in Vietnam that was fighting in the Viet Cong's backyard along the canals of the Mekong River. Operating at night, often dressed like the VC, squads of 2 to 7 men turned the tables on their enemy. Wading through canals or inserted by boat to get to their target, this unconventional unit used kidnapping and bribery to accomplish what killing could not. The Viet Cong called them men with green faces.
SEALs were looking for a place to work, and the Army had the Rung Sat Special Zone. Nobody could operate in it. The VC ruled it, and they said, well, you guys can work in the water. Put you in there. And so they had 3 platoons over there operating against the VC, and pretty well cleared the place out.
Throughout the Mekong Delta region, Navy SEAL platoons were creating serious disruptions in the Viet Cong political infrastructure, which heretofore had operated freely on the rivers and canals.
There was some pride in doing the operation elegantly, and one of the most elegant ways was to creep right into their encampment or their hooch and lift up that mosquito net, and the first thing he knows is the guy with the green face and the silenced pistol is there saying, come along with me.
Day or night, especially when they knew our trails, it would be dreadful. After a while, we learned from these experiences, and we would spread out our patrol formation. We would try to anticipate where they were waiting in ambush, or where they landed, and then fight them there.
Operations had to be done quietly and skillfully to avoid detection.
The standard operating procedure back then was for the point man and the patrol leader to enter the hooch. There weren't any doors. From then, things got sticky if the guy had bodyguards, and especially if they were awake. If they were asleep or if he didn't have any bodyguards, things normally went pretty smoothly. And then it was a matter of abducting the guy, search, silence, and securing him, and getting out there as quickly as possible.
The U.S. Navy SEALs in Vietnam fought for their country and their teammates. Their intentions were not just to observe the enemy, they planned to capture or kill him.
You'll be exposed to pain and punishment for one reason and one reason only: to make you the type of person we need to get the job done.
We, the Navy SEALs, went there to win the hearts and minds of anybody. We were there to kick the ass out of the enemy. We were there to destroy him. We were there to shoot the bastard. We were there to destroy his camps. We weren't there to worry about what the next-door neighbor thought about us. We were there to do a job.
Tax collectors and high-ranking VC and NVA officials were the preferred target. SEALs and their special boat units were giving new meaning to the term up close and personal.
Đi bằng đêm.
Our areas. Sometimes, 3 to 6 commandos would ambush us on our travel road with mines. Usually, they used claymore mines.
The rules for special operations were the same, both on the borders of Vietnam and in the dark waters of the Mekong. Special Ops forces were called on to do whatever was necessary to accomplish their missions.
To my knowledge, we never, ever killed an innocent person. If we were fighting on a village, everybody's the enemy. Hard to understand, but when somebody's shooting out of a door, they don't put a sign on them saying, I'm the bad guy, okay? And I'm sitting there with 5 people, and I got 40, 50 guns shooting down my neck. We would shoot and shoot and shoot till we got our way out of there.
Suspicion was the rule. Every bar girl was a VC. Every barber was an NVA colonel. The enemy might be a child with a grenade or a teenage girl with an AK-47. The most difficult challenge was knowing when and where to draw the line.
We learned we had to get like that in order to operate among the Vietnamese people over there. Because you never really knew who you were going to encounter. You might walk up on an old farmer, or you might walk up on some guy carrying an AK-47 with this selector switch and full automatic. So we had to take every edge.
SEALs turned VC guerrillas against their old comrades with a simple promise of protection.
A lot of these guys were coerced into being in the Viet Cong ranks. And it didn't take much persuasion at all to say, look, we'll get you out of this. We'll essentially put you in the witness protection program, get you down the south end of the island or over on the mainland or something, and get your family out of here. And they say, thanks, great. And all you got to do is just take us back in and lead us to the clown that recruited you. No problem.
Special operators frequently found the situation on the ground did not relate to concepts planned for them in Saigon and Washington. Unconventional warfare wasn't always about an overwhelming force. Guerrilla war demanded an ability to adapt to this situation.
John Paul Vann once said, the best way to kill a guerrilla is with a knife and the worst way is with an airplane. And when you're doing things surgically like that, 7 men, it's up close. You know you're not killing civilians. You know you're killing a guy with a rifle, and an important guy with a rifle.
Ruthless, determined, and secret, this unconventional war became one of American guerrilla versus Vietnamese guerrilla. The irony is that American unconventional soldiers adopted many of the tactics of their VC and NVA enemy. No other combat force in Vietnam achieved a greater success than did the various units of special operations. Decades later, some realities are emerging. Ho Chi Minh's objective of subjugating Southeast Asia failed. Communism has faltered around the world, giving way to market-driven economies, which have emerged throughout Indochina and increasingly in Vietnam. But only time will tell whether the country of Vietnam fully embraces the same democratic principles the American Special Operations Forces fought for decades ago.